Snapshot 23w03 has arrived, the first snapshot of the year and the first for an upcoming new version of Minecraft, version 1.19.4. This snapshot contains new accessibility features, bug fixes, and lots of command news. My name is Slice Slime, come with me on a tour of this snapshot. Let's start with mob news. The Vex used to display a gesture that could, with a great deal of imagination, be interpreted as offensive if it attacked without a weapon. That is changed in this version. Goats can now spawn on grass when passive mob spawning occurs after world generation. And a problem with villager AI has been fixed, which could cause them to freeze entirely in place. In gameplay news, goat horns without any instrument dataset now properly play a sound. A very old bug has been fixed where the camera wobble that occurs when you take damage always showed in the same direction. In very old versions and in single player only, this wobble would depend on the direction of incoming damage, which is now also the case in this snapshot both in single player and multiplayer. While this has been made out to be a huge deal by some people in the community, the difference in effect is fairly minimal. Speaking of damage, when an entity died in combat, the status of previous actions is now properly tracked, which allows some death messages to display fully now. If you entered an end portal while sleeping in a bed, that bed would show as occupied permanently. The bug is now fixed. Fire charges are now properly consumed when you ignite a creeper using them in survival or adventure mode. A number of problems with the weather effects in different biomes have been fixed. This includes powder snow filling cauldrons despite there being rain rather than snow, burning mobs not getting extinguished by rain, Riptide not working, and similar problems. If you sprint while riding an entity that cannot sprint, your field of view will no longer widen as if you were going faster. And armor stands now keep their custom names when you place and break them. Hopper minecarts no longer work slower if they happen to be at the exact origin of the world. And a bug with hopper minecarts failing to pick up items out of piles of mixed things has also been fixed. Some news about the experimental gameplay functionality as well. These features are only available if you enable the Update 120 experimental data pack when you create your world. Mob heads can now be placed on top of note blocks without sneaking. For the experimental camels, a second player riding them no longer moves the first player if the camel doesn't have a saddle. Camels no longer sometimes sit down for a split second when spawned, and no longer sometimes sit down for a split second when they take damage. If a camel had been idle for a very long time, riding it could cause you to end up in a completely different height, which is also fixed in the snapshot. And the logical facing direction of the camel can no longer be in directions their heads cannot physically turn. In options and accessibility news, there is a new welcome screen the first time the game is started.
Press enter to enable the narrator.
This screen lets you turn on the narrator and provides immediate access to the accessibility settings. There's also a new option called Notification Display Time, which controls how long the toast notification pop-ups stay on screen. Menu screens can now be navigated using the arrow key as an alternative to the tab key navigation. When doing this, sliders need to be activated using the enter or space buttons before they can be moved. And a bug has been fixed that let tab navigation select more than one button at a time. The resource pack screen can now be navigated using the keyboard, which works like the single player world list and server lists worked before. Hold down shift to move the selected item. The auto jump option is now off by default. Okay, before we go on with even more awesome stuff, please take a moment to auto jump onto that like button for the video. It really helps, so I'd really appreciate it. Thanks! Some minor fixes have been made to the UI in the game, including the telemetry data button now having the correct label, and the buttons in the multiplayer menu now being evenly spaced. In visual news, Magma Cube shadows now have the correct size depending on the size of the Magma Cube. A bug has been fixed that caused Guardian beams to not show in old worlds, and some small tweaks have been made to the saddle textures of skeleton and zombie horses. In technical news, the datapack format is now 11 to reflect some changes to commands and text components. Speaking of commands, there are also many additions in this version. Let's begin with some news for old commands. The clone command can now clone between different dimensions. This is done by adding from followed by the dimension ID before the source coordinates, or to followed by the dimension ID before the destination coordinates. Just like before, the source and target areas must be loaded for the command to work. The data command has a new source available. It's called string and has the same source and path specification as the from source. However, instead of loading the value as is, it will convert the value to a string and then load it. It also has two optional arguments at the end for a starting and ending index, allowing only a substring to be copied. The execute command also got a number of new additions. Let's start with execute if and unless, which have two new options. The first one is execute if or unless loaded followed by a position. This continues the execution if or unless that area is fully loaded. That is, it has both blocks and entities fully present. The second one is execute if or unless dimension followed by a dimension ID. This continues the execution only if or unless the dimension ID matches the current dimension. There's also an entirely new execute subcommand. Execute on followed by a relationship specification. This lets you execute on a related entity of the currently executing one. There are 7 available relations. Vehicle lets you execute on the vehicle the current entity is riding. Passengers lets you execute on all the passengers riding the current entity. Controller lets you execute on the passenger steering a vehicle, such as the first player in a boat. Owner lets you execute on the owner of a tamed animal. Leasher lets you execute on the entity holding the leash of a leashed entity, which might be a leash knot entity if the leash is tied to a fence. Target lets you execute on the selected target for a mob attacking something. And finally, Attacker lets you execute on the entity that last damaged the executing entity within the latest 5 seconds. There are also changes to time parameters. All the arguments to title times are now time durations, which means they now work with T, S, and D suffixes. The times specified in the weather command are now also time parameters, which means that they default to ticks rather than seconds, and T, S, and D can be used to specify. This means that to retain your old functionality, you will need to add an S to the end of your weather times. The lowest possible duration is now 1 tick, and if the time is not specified, the weather will now last as long as it normally would if it switched to that weather state through the normal course of gameplay. There's also a brand new command in this version, ride. This command can force an entity to mount or dismount another entity. The syntax is ride followed by target and then either mount or dismount. In the case of mount, this is followed by the new vehicle. This only works if the target is not already riding something and it would be possible to ride that entity. It is also not possible to make anything ride a player. Let's wrap up this humongous command section with some more fixes. Commands in command blocks now point the right way when using local coordinates. And the spectate and spread players commands have been fixed to work properly when crossing into other dimensions. Whew, we're not done yet though. Let's go on to a new game rule. It is called Command Modification Block Limit and controls the maximum number of blocks that can be affected by one execution of the clone, fill, and fill biome commands. In tags, there are a number of added biome tags. Increased fire burnout controls which biomes fires burn out quicker in. Yep, that's the thing. The only allows snow and gold rabbits tag has been removed, and instead there are now spawns white rabbits and spawns gold rabbits tags. The spawning of white foxes is now controlled by the spawns snow foxes biome tag. Snow golems melting is now controlled by the snow golem melts biome tag. And in the Update 120 experimental data pack, there's also a new noteblock top instruments item tag. In news for text components, a bug has been fixed where out-of-bounds arguments would be silently ignored. This bug was previously abused to implement fallback-like functionality, which is now instead supported by an optional fallback field, which is used if there is no translation available. If there's neither a translation nor a fallback, the translation key itself is displayed just like before. Finally, in custom world news, the biome definition field for precipitation type has been removed and is now instead a has precipitation boolean field. And that's it for 23w03a. My name is Slicelime, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.